Welcome to a new episode of Ideas for India Conversations. Thank you for joining us. I'm Farzana Afridi, Professor of Economics at ISI Delhi, and your host for today. I'm extremely delighted and honored to be in conversation with Professor Sonalde Desai, who's our guest today. Professor Desai, she needs no introduction whatsoever, but just for the uninitiated, I'd like to say a few words about her work and the extremely influential and extremely powerful work that she's done over the years. Professor Desai is a distinguished university professor at the University of Maryland College Park, and she's also a professor at the National Council of Applied Economic Research in Delhi, where she also directs the National Data Innovation Center. Professor Desai is a sociologist and demographer whose work has primarily dealt with social inequalities in developing countries, with a particular focus on gender and class inequalities in education, employment, and maternal and child health. Most of her research has focused on South Asia, but she has also conducted several studies in other parts of Asia, Latin America, and Sub-Saharan Africa. I think all of us know Professor Desai through her contribution in India's context to this great public good that she has created, which is the India Human Development Survey, the IHDS, which is a nationwide panel survey of over 40,000 households, which started in 2004-05. And currently we are in wave 3 of IHDS, which is in the field and will be spanning 2022 and 2023. And we are really excited and looking forward to those data. The IHDS has been publicly available to all researchers and has been used by over 11,000 users worldwide to deeply understand some of the socioeconomic facts and trends in India. Professor Desai has been the president of the Population Association of America. She's a fellow of the American Association for Advancement of Science and is a member of the Committee on Population of the National Academy of Sciences. She has also served on a variety of committees for the Government of India, and currently she is on the Standing Committee on Statistics. So welcome, Professor Desai. Thank you so much for joining us and giving us time. I would like to start with a broad question to really try to bring to the table the issue about demographic transition that India is currently going through and is expected to go through over the next few decades. So we know that India's population has overtaken that of China's. India's population is going to peak at about 1.7 billion people in 2064. Currently, the median age in India is 28 years, while the share of Indians who are 65 and older is going to go up from 7% to 20% in 2063. So in the next 40 to 50 years, the country is going to go through rapid demographic transition. So my question to you is in two parts. The first is, over this period when we are experiencing this demographic dividend, where we have this large share of young working age population, are we able to take advantage? And the second is, as we now start transitioning to an aging population, and I know you've been talking about it in a lot of the pieces that you've been writing in policy outlets, how do we prepare for this transition from a very young to an aging population?
Thank you, Farzana. First of all, I just want to say thank you for inviting me. I'm honored to be in this conversation. I think a population in India has always inspired this incredible passions, right? Since 1960s, we have on one hand been worrying about overpopulation and growth of Indian population. And now, at least in some parts of India, we are worrying about declining population or at least declining fertility rate, which would lead to a sort of a transition in the age structure in these areas. Okay? So I think it helps us to take a little bit of a historical overview of where we have been and compare ourselves to other countries and their experiences. So, as you very rightly pointed out, Indian population is continuing to grow, and it's continuing to grow in spite of the fact that Indian families are having only about 2 children per couple, okay, which should be seen as a replacement fertility. However, given the fact that we have had a historically younger population, the population momentum will continue for India to keep growing until 1960s. Uh, there was a time when we would have worried a lot about this population momentum and its impact. But as we look around the world, what we have discovered is that countries which experience very rapid fertility decline, okay, have also been approaching a sort of a demographic cliff in which their population is suddenly aging with a fewer number of workers. Okay? As we think about economic growth and its relationship to population growth, I guess what we want to think about is how many working age people there are who are supporting dependents, either they are young or the elderly. Okay? And in some ways, India at this point in time is very much approaching a demographic transition, where dependency burden is declining, a number of workers are increasing, they will continue to increase for some time, and then again the dependency burden will become a major issue as these same people become older. Now, it's true that the more the workers you have, the more economic productivity there can be. Okay? However, it's truly surprising to me that we are sort of talking about demographic dividend now when we have a tremendous untapped market in the workers that we have failed to use. Okay? So, for example, if you think in terms of comparing India to countries like China, the Chinese female labor force participation rate is so high that it has a much greater worker base than we do, in spite of the fact that they are aging far more rapidly than we are. Okay?
Right.
So I think that demographic dividend is a great story. It's important to think about, but we can actually lengthen our demographic dividend by making sure that all we are taking advantage of our full workforce, which includes women. The second part of the issue that we would face is the fact that we need to make the full use of our workers and make sure that they are fully engaged and productive. And South Asia is one of the areas of the world where underemployment remains a major challenge. Okay? While unemployment rates have been generally low, and most of it is because people keep finding whatever work they can do. Okay? That doesn't mean that they are fully engaged in a productive work. So if we want to take real advantage of our demographic dividend, I think what we are going to need to have to do is A, incorporate everybody in the workforce and create opportunities. B, ensure that the people who are available are fully engaged and productive, able to contribute. Now, we talk a lot about the fact that, oh, this can be done through skills. But I'm not totally convinced that skills are the answer, because increasing skill does not mean that there will be increasing number of jobs to absorb these skilled people. So I think we need to have both a skill transition and a labor market transition happen at the same time to take best advantage of the demographic dividend.
So what you basically saying is that there's a lot more that we can do in order to increase the engagement of the workforce, increase the quality and productivity of the work that is being done by our workforce. And finally, we need to create demand for good quality work and jobs for this workforce in order to fully take advantage of the current phase of the demographic dividend that we have, right?
Absolutely. The second part is you were talking about the potential aging as we go along. And yes, aging is going to become an issue both from the perspective of the society and the family. From social perspective, we will be dealing with a greater number of older population who would be dependent on shrinking base of workers. Okay? From a family perspective, we will be dealing with the fact that life expectancy is increasing. Okay? So it's not just the number of elderly, but the number of years that this elderly would live and will need to be supported both of financially and in terms of physical care. And I think again, this is a good time to think about it, to be able to plan for it, because if we don't, then it becomes a sudden cliff. Right? So the
Right.
question is, how do we plan for it? Okay? And I think that there are a number of things that we'll need to think about. The first part is that the India has probably one of the youngest retirement ages. You know, typically we think of retirement somewhere between 58 to 65. Okay? As life expectancy increases, health improves, perhaps thinking about raising our notions about when a person should retire would be a useful thing to do. Okay? Second part of it is that demographic change comes with a family transformation, which is that the reason we will be facing the aging is that people have fewer children. Okay? And not only do they have fewer children, they also may or may not have an adult son to take care of them. Okay? Now, we live in a society which has been so hugely gendered, okay, that there is parents' great reliance remains on their sons. Okay? And so I think that we are going to need a rethinking of our familial institutions. A, should children be the primary source of care and financial support for their parents? Or can we put in place a system in which there are alternative sources of care and finances? B, are our legal and inheritance systems well placed to be able to deal with some of these demands? For example, um, could we really continue with this whole notion of inheritance laws, which are very much set up in such a way that parents are not able to alienate or monetize the property that they own? Okay, perhaps we will need to change some of these inheritance laws. Okay, we may also need to change some of the gender structures such that the sole reliance on sons and preference for sons begins to dissolve to a level where parents are able to live with, accept support from both their sons and daughters. Okay, so I think that we may be facing a tremendous family upheaval, and as a society we'll need to think about how to deal with it. Housing structures will be another thing that we may have to think about, because as increasingly children become mobile and move out of areas and move to a different place, how will where will parents live? How will they be taken care of? Can they migrate with their children? Should there be sort of other types of housing arrangements? Should there be other types of social support networks? So I think for us to start thinking about how we would handle aging going forward, maybe something that we really need to start looking at now rather than wait until this issue becomes problematic.
Yeah, absolutely, Asuna. So that was really comprehensively putting together all the potential issues, for instance, investments in public health, investments in social security. One of the ways in which we could do that is by increasing the age of retirement, because people will also be living healthier lives for longer. But one of the things that I hadn't thought about, which you brought to the table very nicely, is really the cultural changes that need to accompany in order to accommodate an aging population. And our dependence on children is primarily because of the lack of social security that exists in a developing country context. So all of those things are going to become extremely important. You mentioned that the reason we will start having this aging is going to be because we've reached more or less the replacement fertility rate in India overall, when we look at the average for the country. We've also made tremendous progress in reducing gender gaps in education. We made not as much, but also some significant progress in reducing infant mortality rates, improving other indicators of human development. What we are seeing, the average across the country, but you also pointed out, for instance, that there is a lot of imbalance, regional imbalances within India, with some places where they're really still far away from reaching the replacement fertility rate, where gender gaps are still very high. Indicators of human development are poor, particularly when we look at the eastern part of the country. What do you think are the underlying causes of these wide regional differences? That's number one. But also going forward, we are talking in terms of averages, but then we need to balance these different trends across different parts of the country. And so, what implications would that have for future economic growth and labor markets?
The demographic discourse has been tends to see certain areas as laggard states. These are the states which are lagging in fertility decline, in demographic transition. And we see other states as sort of this advanced states, particularly the southern states. What's very interesting is that going forward, actually much of our workers are going to come from these lagging states. Okay,
Absolutely.
so I think that we need to change our language and we need to change our thinking and to say that look, if workers are a resource, okay, resources of the future are going to come from eastern and northern states. Okay, and we need to find ways of investing in these workers so that our future workforce is sufficiently skilled. Okay? So, in some sense, instead of seeing them as their pariahs or laggard states, I think we need to start seeing these as resources in which we need to invest so that we make sure that our future of both the demographically advanced states as well as the nation as a whole is brighter rather than sort of leaving them behind. Now, what it means is we need to invest in education systems in these states. Okay? We need to make it a little bit easier for people to migrate for work because at some point in time, the workers of Kerala and healthcare providers of Kerala are going to be coming from Bihar. Okay?
Mhm.
And we need to make sure that they are able to migrate, they are able to settle and integrate. We also need to enhance the economic opportunities in the states in which a large proportion of workers will be living, right? So the idea that your industrial growth, okay, is sort of focused around coastal belt, okay, might have to be abandoned, and we might now need to start thinking about how to ensure a sufficient industrial growth in UP and Bihar and West Bengal and other such states. Okay? So I think that basically demography is very difficult to change, but we are very fortunate that we have a forewarning of what we'll be facing 20 or 30 years from now. And what we need to do is start thinking about adapting to it and managing it.
Yeah, I think that the point that you made about the fact that there will be movements of people from the areas which have higher population, higher availability of workers. And some of it we've been seeing over the last few years, in terms of movement from the eastern part to Punjab. And it's going to become much more apparent and stronger, this mobility that we are going to see. And that brings me sort of to the next question about the fact that very often it is movement from rural areas to urban areas where most of the work opportunities exist. And we have been seeing an increase in the urbanization rate in India, and urbanization has been picking up at a rapid pace, along with this, the sectoral shifts that we are seeing from agriculture to services. Unfortunately, we don't have, a large manufacturing base. So let me first ask you this question. In order to be able to absorb this population of workers, you mentioned that we should, create opportunities. So, what are the policies that we can adopt in the more developed, let's say, and lower workforce population areas in order to be able to absorb? Because agriculture has limited capacity,
Right.
manufacturing has not grown as much. So, what, according to you, would be the policies for absorbing these people?
You know, I think that we should be thinking about two sets of policies. Okay, one set is where there is uh, low fertility, greater demand for workers, making sure that migration can be done more easily, managed well, and people can be integrated. Second, we might also think about creating jobs in areas of origin. So, in both require a different kind of mindset. So, the first one with respect to migration, okay, uh, it, uh, it's actually virtually no society finds migration easy to manage and handle. And in some countries, there is a cultural homogeneity which makes migration not so visible. India does not have that kind of a cultural homogeneity. We have tremendous diversity, right? And so we are going to have to figure out ways by which these migrants are seen as contributors and create a language and a belief around it rather than sort of taking away jobs from the local population. You know, the resistance to migration has been endemic in our society, starting with things like Amchi Mumbai movement, which was quite resistant to southern migrants in Mumbai. We see sort of a nativism and resistance to migration in Tamil Nadu. Okay? And I think we need a political leadership, okay, which sees that we are not talking about different pieces of a country, but we're talking about a unified India. We're talking about economic growth that requires the migrants to be able to come and integrate into these various societies. So, creating public policies which are which facilitate migration would be very useful. I mean, for example, I think this one nation, one ration card is a very good idea, right?
Mm.
So something like that. Similarly, in ability to not having to prove your place of residence everywhere under the sun,
Right.
get your children into the school without having to worry about show the residence certificate, and some of those kinds of things would be very useful.
Right.
On the second front, okay, which is creating jobs into some of these sending areas. Okay, look, every government wants to create jobs. It's not very easy to do, right? And I don't think I have any prescriptions to say how are we going to create jobs in Lucknow and Sitapur and other such places. But at least our research has shown us a few things. Okay, the one thing that we do know is that commuter migration can be a great source of employment. Right?
Mm.
And commuter migration is basically people continuing to live in rural areas and working in nearby towns. And commuter migration is facilitated by better public transportation, roads, infrastructure, buses. And one of the things that one of my colleagues, Leila and I, had found that building of roads and improving bus services actually increased non-farm employment for both men and women, but particularly for women. Okay, because women tend not to migrate as heavily as men do. Being able to go up and down and work in nearby areas makes a difference. So for us to just start thinking about what can we do to create jobs in the home locations of these growing areas would be a useful thing to think about.
Yeah, I thought the point that you raised about transportation is extremely important, and the other issue about portability of your migrant is sort of you're not carrying your identity, but rather portability of access to public services,
Right.
which is education, the PDS system, and so on and so forth. And I think just being able to track these movements, which is something that we faced during the pandemic, where it was, this mass movement back really to the rural areas, and we were helpless. But we have no data available as such on the sheer numbers of people who move to these locations and how we can help them integrate into the new locations in which they are currently placed in. So I just wanted to, bring some of the trends you might be observing in the IHTS, which is now going to be released very soon. What do you see in terms of the trends in migration rates? Traditionally, we've said that there is a lot of movement from within districts rather than between districts,
Mhm.
right? And do you see that sort of continuing? Do you see people moving longer distances? The reasons that they're moving for? Typically, we see women are moving mainly for marriage, and these gender differences that you see. Is there anything that you're seeing in terms of changes as a population evolves?
For Farsan, let me talk a little bit more sort of impressionistically about this, largely because the database that you talked about, we are still collecting it. We haven't
Absolutely,
analyzed it or
absolutely, yeah.
looked at it. Okay. But impressionistically, we are seeing a couple of different things. One, within district migration has really picked up perhaps more than we realized, largely because people are moving to nearby towns for work as well as education of their children. It's quite amazing to go to a rural area wanting to interview a Pradhan and discover that Pradhan actually doesn't live there, has a home there,
Ah,
but lives in the nearby district town.
I
Okay?
see. Yeah.
And that has been happening quite a bit. Okay?
Right.
So within district moves are certainly happening, but we are also seeing longer moves. Okay? And the longer moves are often associated with work, but they're also associated with education. Okay.
Mm.
And we haven't paid enough attention to educational migration, but just think about quota, right? How
Mm.
many mothers are migrating there with their children so that the children can get coaching and take the exams? Okay. So there is a fairly substantial amount of educational migration. Okay. And certainly, work related migration, shorter and longer distance is again quite visible. The thing is that what we don't always fully yet appreciate is the ties that the migrants develop to the places that they go to. Right?
Mm.
The reason we saw this mass return of migrants during COVID, okay, was that these people were not, I mean, their homes were not in Mumbai and Delhi. Okay.
Right.
They lived in Mumbai and Delhi, but their families, their ties, their children, their wives were often left behind in their places of origin. Okay. Places in UP and Bihar have had generations of habit where the husband migrates and the wife and the children are in the rural area for 20 years, 30 years, forever. Okay. So, in some sense, I think that if we don't want to see this temporary migrant phenomenon, okay, we are going to have to figure out how the whole families can migrate, right? Which requires both availability of housing, okay, and some of the portability of public service access, particularly education. So I think migration is a fact. Migration is increasing, in my opinion. Okay?
Mm.
It's diversifying in nature in terms of what kind of migration we see. But we as a society haven't yet quite adapted to it, okay, to be able to manage it in a way that is optimal and beneficial to the society.
Right. No, I thought that was really interesting what you said about the women moving with the children for their education, which is very interesting because all we see in terms of the statistics is women moving for marriage and the men moving for work or for education. And I think we need a new category when we are looking at our secondary data, national data being collected, which is moving for children's education and for their human capital investment. And so you very rightly, as you pointed out, was as these movements happen to our cities, we really need to think about how we are going to be able to accommodate and assimilate them in terms of the infrastructure that exists in these cities. You talked about transportation, you talked about housing, and of course, the availability of basic services such as water, sanitation, all of those become a challenge because of this, movement from rural to urban areas, which sort of brings me to, thinking about what has happened in China over the years, right? Which is a lot of left behind families, women being left behind, but the men moving, and of course, now there are also a lot of women who move to urban areas to work in China, but they have the hukou system, which is the residential
Hmm.
system, which doesn't
Right.
allow you to access public services to the place that you move to, which is not your residence. And I think we are not, in that state where we do need to transition to portability of your identity, your access to public services, but at the same time we need to create space and infrastructure to be able to accommodate these movements. You mentioned about women moving for the children's education, which brings me to an area that you've done so much work on, which is on women's labor force participation. And one of the things that I know you've been writing about is the fact that we need to focus not just on the level, the fact that there is low labor force participation, but really also to talk about the quality of work. But let me first ask you a question about your concerns around the measurement of women's participation in the workforce. And I know that you've been writing about how the quality of this measurement may have been declining over time. So, really, to be able to pass out the fact that we've been talking about a decline in women's labor force participation, we need to think about how the measurement has been changing dynamically in order to be able to uh, give that as a reason for these measurement issues, right? So I really
Yeah.
want you to spend a little bit more time explaining to us what your concerns are about these dynamic changes and dynamic issues with measurement.
Basically, as you know, we have seen a steady decline in women's labor force participation from 2004-5 to about 2017-18 using labor force surveys. After 2018, suddenly there was a rapid increase in female labor force participation rate, which almost doubled between 18 and 23. Okay. Now, if you look around us, I don't think we are seeing such massive changes in our society that we see this huge number of women dropping out and a huge number of women suddenly joining the labor force. Uh, if once you start parsing out where we are seeing changes in what kind of work, what we find is that the wage labor has been more or less steady with a slight increase. Okay. Where we have seen really the big changes are women working on family farms and family businesses, where there was a rapid decline and then there is a rapid increase. Okay,
Right.
neither of those make any sense, right? Because you could say that, well, families are getting richer, so women are dropping out and not doing the house, working in the family farms. But then why should we be seeing the increase afterwards? Okay. Or you could say that mechanization is forcing women to drop out. If that is the case, again, you shouldn't be seeing a later increase. Okay. So this sort of decline and increase, I think, is a function of how we are measuring female labor force participation. Um, one of the problems with measuring women's work, particularly women's work in things like agriculture, okay, is that our respondents don't always understand what we are asking them when we conduct surveys. We ask them, oh, what is the primary activity you do? And they will say, well, I do nothing, I'm at home. Okay. But really, they may be doing a variety of other things. They just didn't think you wanted to know about it. Right. So, what ends up happening is that either we word our questions in such a way that we prompt them to think about these activities as work, or we train our interviewers to probe and ask these questions correctly. Okay.
Right.
Now, what used to happen was that the labor force data that was collected through National Sample Survey historically relied on well-trained interviewers. So they were very, they were permanent workers, they were well-trained, they understood the areas that they came from, and they could ask, even though your questionnaire doesn't actually probe, they could probe and get women's labor force participation in a better way. Over time, what started happening was that we started using more contract workers, the training levels declined. And so the interviewers couldn't intuitively ask or probe in the way they used to do before. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
To replace that, what we may have to do would be to improve the way we ask the questions and improve the whole survey design itself. Okay, so that you're not relying on an interviewer to interpret the questions. Rather, your questions are fairly straightforward, which would say, yes, your household has a buffalo. Who takes care of the buffalo? Okay,
Right.
rather than asking women, what do you do? Right. So I think that improving the way we ask this question and measurement would make it easier to capture women's work on family farms and family businesses. Okay. But that said, okay, um, there is another reason why we need to improve the measurement, because essentially all our discourse seems to be around whether the female labor force participation is declining or not, and whether it is increasing or not, instead of focusing on the quality of jobs, on the availability of work that actually brings in income. Okay, so if we are to focus on some of these deeper and more important issues, in my opinion, okay, we need to kind of get rid of this uh, mm, 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 sort of a blurring that occurs
Yes,
because the
absolutely.
data collection quality is poor.
Yeah, no, I absolutely agree with you, Sonal, that we need to focus not on the trends because we are haggling over something that is primarily irrelevant because the level is so low, which is what you said at the beginning, which is we need to get more of them into the workforce. I just had this quick thought. What your sense is from the current round of the IHDS in terms of the levels of participation of women in the workforce. And I know that you don't want to give a certain answer because the data is still being put together. You've been in the rural areas. What sense do you get about attitudes and norms towards women's work and how that might be affecting these women's labor force participation in terms of this current round?
You know, again, I'm going to give you impressionistic sense
Absolutely.
rather than actually a database, and I may have to reverse myself in a year's time, right?
No, that's fine.
Look, we all know that education for women has really zoomed up in India, urban, rural areas, everywhere, right? With a large number of educated women, okay, there is clearly a desire to be able to find work. Okay,
Mhm.
the problem is that it's not very easy for them to do so, right?
Mhm.
So I think what happens is that you get education, you no longer really want to do manual work. Okay?
Yes.
And non-manual work is not very easily available to you. Okay? But what we do find is this, that where work has expanded, women have taken advantage of it. Okay.
Mhm.
The areas where, again, transportation improved, women started working in non-agricultural work.
Mhm.
Introduction of Narega actually brought out so many women into the labor force who never had done any wage labor before. Okay?
Right.
And Narega was seen as this respectable work being given by the government,
Right.
in spite of the fact that it was manual. Okay? So I think that once work becomes available, people will be more interested. I still remember actually interviewing a Dalit woman with a college degree. Okay. She was not working. She was at home taking care of her children, very politically conscious, very aware, engaged with the world. So I said, well, you have such good training. Why aren't you working? And she said, but हम तो फार्म भरते ही जाते हैं, फार्म भरते ही जाते हैं, कोई जॉब ही नहीं मिलती. We
Right.
keep filling out forms. We keep filling out forms. There is no job. Okay. So I think for women, there is a big discouraged worker effect that is very latent out there. And you'd hope that if opportunities increase, they would probably take up.
I had quite a few questions, follow-up questions on the issues, the points that you raised. One was really about creating demand for women's labor, and it's not just any demand, but it is when you essentially go back to Claudia Goldin's hypothesis and this theoretical sort of the U-shaped uh, curve that she talked about, which is it is not just important to educate women, but at the same time, simultaneously providing work which is um, acceptable in a sense of, not being, as you said, manual work, but being slightly higher status work, because as you go up the education ladder, you don't want to do manual work. But there is a tremendous number and proportion of the population which is still at the secondary education level, for whom manual work or work in the manufacturing sector or in the factories would be something that they would still be willing to do if it brings them a good wage and is in a safe environment. Transportation is extremely important. And I totally agree with you on the fact that we don't have a focus when we look at mobility issues from a gender perspective, right? Especially when we're talking about safety issues of women traveling to work. And so, one of the reasons why Nareka also did very well in terms of women's participation is because it's close to home. And, being able to not go very far, but also balance work at home. So,
Mhm.
Mike, I want to come back to this question about whether you sense the fact that as women are getting more educated, is there also an accompanying change in the attitudes of the men in their family towards women stepping out and working? You said that woman kept saying that she applies for jobs and doesn't get it. I also sense that many of them want to get public sector government jobs, which would be higher status, that is preferred for women. What is your sense in terms of what the men's attitudes are towards women, and whether it's evolving or not?
This is a very interesting question. Okay. And I don't think I have a very good answer. I can give you a couple of issues here. Okay. One is that's very interesting is there used to be a time when men consistently wanted to marry women who had lower education than themselves. The man should be more educated or should be earning more, he should be taller, and so on. Right. But now, actually, we have a very large number or pretty significant minority of families in which the wife has more education than the husband. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
So clearly, there is some shift that is taking place. Okay. In recognizing that a woman's education brings some value to the family. Okay. Um, as of now, it's being seen in the context of educating children. Okay? That an educated mother will be able to supervise homework, our children will do well, family would improve. Okay? But I don't see any reason why it can't be expanded to income if they are able to earn good income. Now, that said, I'm not sure that families are yet ready for inconveniences that would accompany having a working wife, okay, or a working mother. Okay, um, would it just lead to double burden on women? Okay, if we look at currently employed urban women, we see that their household responsibilities are not going down. Okay? They are adding on through work responsibilities and perhaps reducing time needed for the domestic chores. Instead of fetching firewood, you might get gas. Instead of having to get water, you will get a tapped water. So you can use some of the domestic conveniences to reduce the burden, but still the large chunk of work burden remains with women. So that's where I think we are coming back to the Golding's point of,
Right.
increased burden on women of both the work and the household. Okay. The other part is, of course, that think about women with secondary education who are not necessarily expecting to be government officers, but they would like to have jobs which are reasonably well paying in a safe location and so on. And I think this is where actually our challenge is also around occupational sex segregation and
Right.
employer bias, right?
Yes.
There is no particular reason why your taxi driver can't be a woman. Okay.
Mhm.
That's certainly the kind of work that a secondary educated woman can do, right? But we see very few female taxi drivers. Okay. Even government jobs, okay, like post service delivery people, okay, you don't see any women doing it. Okay. So the middle level jobs, both manufacturing and service jobs, okay, there is a female exclusion, okay, uh, which basically also shuts these women out of your opportunity structure.
Right. So I think two interesting points. One is, even as women are getting educated, your view is that a lot of it is from the perspective of investments in the children's human capital. And we have some other previous work done in India, which was, for example, looking at the Green Revolution, Foster, Rosenzweig, and so on, talking about how the demand for women who were educated went up because then they could teach their kids, and they're more educated people then can use the new technology better. And so that's one. So the value of an educated wife increases, but at the same time there is this challenge about providing them good opportunities. And you talked about occupational segregation, which is extremely stark in India, so to speak. And I was wondering whether you want to dwell on it a little bit more. There is employer bias, definitely. But also, when we are looking at issues about skilling women in these new occupations, for example, as you said, driving, and we're seeing, delivery, for instance, is going up a lot, Uber services,
Mhm.
we don't see women being trained in the sense of take up of these opportunities. What are the ways in which we can get these women to pick up these skills? At one end, of course, we can't address uh, biases that employers have, unless there are some policy changes and maybe there are quotas for women and so on and so forth. It might evolve over time. But from the supply side, what is it that you feel is stopping these women from picking these skills? And that takes me back to these gender attitudes and what is the kind of work women should do. What can we do about it?
It's a interesting question. Okay. I think you have hit upon something that it's very clear that women in small numbers in any occupation feel pretty uncomfortable. Right?
Mm,
Being a single woman on a shop floor or being a single woman mechanic in a garage could be a very uncomfortable situation.
right,
Having programs where there are multiple women participating in these activities would reduce some of the barriers.
right,
So, for example, why is it that in US, the secretarial work is a female-dominated occupation? In India, it's a male-dominated occupation, right? Most of the clerical work is being done by men in most offices. Okay, so in some sense, I think that you need to create opportunities for at least a core number of women for these occupations to start becoming acceptable. The more interesting one is that in India, we have a large number of women in medical colleges, which you don't see in other parts of the world. Right?
right.
So there is nothing God given in terms of what occupations men do and what occupations women do. But there is a certain sort of inertia of entering into certain occupations. Okay? And I guess what we need to be able to do is to figure out how do we break this inertia, that it becomes a comfortable space for women to participate in it. I have to say, we hire field supervisors and field workers who often have to travel alone to monitor a team from one village to another. And typically, we only had male monitors who are going from place to place because they have to go alone. So a young woman had applied, and we were all kind of puzzled. And we asked her, "Will you be able to do this work? Because we can't give you an accompaniment. You'll have to travel alone." And she said, "Ma'am, we have to break these barriers. Unless we do it, how will I get? How will anybody else get an opportunity? And once people like me start doing it, other people will do it too." And she did phenomenally well. Okay. Now, clearly, this is somebody who was a path breaker and willing to take a risk of being the lone person out there, right? But if we can create opportunities for, in some areas, in some types of work situations, for groups of women, it can make a big difference. For example, there was this movement of pink taxis for a while, right? We're training women to be taxi drivers in urban areas. It was done from the perspective that women passengers would feel safe, but it was also an opportunity for women to become drivers. It required training them, it required giving them confidence that they can protect themselves, not be harassed. But those efforts can yield great fruits. Okay? I think we just have to figure out how to do it, and I'm not sure I have a good answer for it.
Yeah, no, no. I think some of the examples that you gave are very pertinent. What we need essentially is a critical mass, which is going to shift the equilibrium from this low level to a high level. When you see more women around you doing the similar kind of work, you're going to also be more willing, and it will also become more acceptable socially to do that work. But I think another thing that you came out in the example that you were giving about field workers, which is what something that I suddenly realized I've experienced as well, that when you look at these field supervisors, for example, very often they are men, and so when we look at within occupation as well, it is women who are in the lower paying, lower ranked work. For example, everybody talks about garment sector and says, oh, there are so many women in the garment sector, but you will see that all the line supervisors are men, the managers are men, and mostly women are relegated to being line level workers. So I think there are twin issues here. One is career progression within occupations, which is a big issue, but also shifting to new occupations. And that both of these are challenges. And I think we really need to put our heads together in terms of creating an equilibrium shift. And as you said, we really don't know what the answer to this is, that we need some sort of a trigger to be able to make that change. And that brings me to, let's a big issue, and we alluded to that in one of the questions where you were talking about the measurement issue and the quality of our data collection and so on. So there have been, in the last few years, several debates on the challenges of conducting surveys. It's not just about the fact that we have issues about training and so on and so forth, but also because of the changes that we are seeing in our population, the urbanization, and we know that response rates can change as a result of that. The developed countries have experienced it. So we have to maintain our statistical quality, keep evolving and learning in order to adapt to these population changes. And then on the other hand, there is also the issue of reliability of these data. We've been worried about the politicization of data and declining trust in statistics, which is happening across the board in several contexts. It's not just developing countries, but also in the US, the different sets of facts, as people would call it. So, first, I wanted to get from you, what do you think are the prerequisites for a robust statistical system to be able to adapt and evolve with the changes that we see in society so that we still keep getting good quality, reliable data?
I think, Farzana, you really hit upon the major issue, which is a worldwide challenge. Okay? the president of Royal Statistical Society in 2017, David Spiegelhalter, gave this presidential address where he actually talked about declining trust in numbers in a post-truth society. Okay? I mean, we are dealing with a world in which there is a tremendous amount of fake news, alternative facts, and there is a lack of clarity in terms of how do we get good data all over the place, right? And we we also recognize that without good data, okay, we cannot operate in a world where you don't understand whether your labor force participation rate is going up or down. So clearly, we need to get good data, and we need to be able to interpret it correctly. We need two things, okay? One is we need to build statistical systems which are able to collect these data and present it and share it in some way that is robust, that is transparent, and so on. And second, we need to figure out how do we deal with people that from whom we are actually trying to get the data about their lives, right? And I think both require thinking on the part of the statistical systems. Okay, I think what we need to really do is, first of all, we just have to focus on investing in these systems. Okay? We need to make sure that the people who are participating in these systems are competent, they are reliable, they are honest, they are free from the political pressures that might go otherwise. I mean, examples in the US were release of data during COVID, which was very politically frowned upon. Right? So creating systems which are independent, competent, and reliable is very important. The second part is about dealing with people from whom we are trying to get the data or our respondents. And I often feel that sometimes we get into these transactional relationships, okay, where your interviewer has X number of interviews they are supposed to be collecting. Okay, I still remember actually sitting in on an interview where my interviewer was trying to get fertility history from the respondent. Okay, and when she would ask some question, the respondent is doesn't quite know that what she's supposed to be giving is a fertility history. She thinks she's supposed to be talking about her children. Okay. And she gets into this conversation about the older daughter who is going to the college, and the younger one is about to approach the college, and the interviewer is trying to bring it back to, but how old were you when you got married? And how old was you when this daughter was born? And so on. Okay. And what I realized was that had she spent about 10 minutes early on, okay, in a conversation with the respondent, trying to sort of understand where she is and what she's living with, her questions would have been much easier. She would have actually managed to capture the fact, okay, that of the three little girls walking around that particular household, one of them was a neighbor's daughter. Okay? But she didn't, right? So in some ways, I think maybe what we need to do is figure out how we collect our data with empathy, okay, and sort of work with our respondents. So to give you an example, okay, as you know, we do panel studies. We go back to the same household time and again. We have been doing this for 20 years. One of the things we realized was that we can't just take their data and go away and come back 7 years down the line. Okay. One of the things we started doing was we started sending them Christmas cards with a little calendar on it every year. Okay. Now it was a massive effort. Okay. 40,000 cards for which imagine sticking the labels, printing the labels, getting them stamped. It's money, it's time, it's effort, but it really paid off. Okay. Because sometimes when we go back, we still find one of those cards sticking in somebody's wall. Okay. So in some sense, if we can figure out a way by which we can develop human relationships, that would be very helpful. The other thing that this is something worries me a little bit about data collection in India is trying to understand what is the best way to approach divided communities. we are a segmented society in some ways. You will have a Nai gully in one corner, you would have a Potter colony in some other corner. Okay, you're going to have to approach these individuals, try to get their cooperation. Do we go through the official sanction and with some pradhan's person introducing us? Do we just go and approach people cold? Do we try to sort of deal with communities and then deal with individuals? I think we need a little better understanding of how to collect data and what is the best way in which we can gain cooperation from our respondents. Okay? And I think that in other countries, there is a tremendous research on research methodologies. Okay? Perhaps we need to have more of that in India.
Right. Yeah, I think all the points that you brought forward are extremely pertinent. And because you're also directing the National Data Innovation Center, I was wondering whether you've been able to do any of these sort of tests, you would say, of how to conduct surveys. And what is really creditable is, as you mentioned, for 20 years you've been at the helm of the IHTS, which is essentially the only nationally representative panel data that we have, and how building relationships with people is extremely important. So, for example, I graduated from the University of Michigan, which is one of the early starters of this, panel study, which has been going on since 1970s, and they're still following people. So, building capacity in our statistical institutions requires some sort of stability in policy, stability in terms of investments, and that requires political will as well, to some extent, right?
I couldn't agree with you more. Okay? Because look, a lot of things that we do, we don't do right the first time around, right? We experiment, we learn, we sort of move forward with it. Okay? And some of this experimental work requires a mindset which says we'll invest in these experiments. Okay? Let me give two examples. Okay, one thing that what happened was when we were collecting fertility histories from the same women at 2 point in time, we realized that some of the births which were reported in wave one were not reported in wave two. And typically, they were either the children who had died or daughters who had married out. Okay. Now, what do you do to ensure that we don't miss out these people, right? Otherwise, we are underestimating infant mortality. We are overstating missing women. Okay. So some of the things we started doing was we started experimenting with how to put reminders for the interviewers and respondents to sort of make sure that these missing births get recovered. Okay. And that's experimental work. I don't know how well it will play out. It turns out actually that we were able to recover quite a bit. So I'm quite pleased with it. But it still is an experiment that is not, no funder is funding you. You just do it because you are interested in it. Right. Second thing actually that I have wondered is our national sample survey has no requirement of who the respondent ought to be. Okay? If you are collecting data on how much rice and oil was purchased and eaten in a household, if you go into North India, you probably want to talk to men because men do the shopping. If you go in South India, you probably want to talk to women. Okay, we haven't done any work that tells us who are the best respondents based on our cultural setting. Right? So I think that it would be great if we could set up a system. In old days, ISI used to do quite a bit of this with NSS. Okay, going back to something like that where we can invest in building our capacities to collect good data would be a very useful thing to do.
I thought that was really fantastic, the example that you gave about who the respondent is. And we just ask questions of the same person, and we don't know whether that is the most knowledgeable person in the household for that particular section of the survey. And of course, the respondents might change, and then the answers would change as well. So thank you. I think we are running out of time. I've already taken 10 minutes more of what we planned, Sonal. So thank you so much. I thoroughly enjoyed the conversation. It was a great learning experience. And thank you for your time. And we, look forward to the release of the IHDS and this journey that will continue on. Thank you so much.
Thank you. This was a lot of fun. Thanks for inviting me.
Thank you.